Are you trying to tell me that this is the first time that you had ever encountered Michel Foucault? It would be hard for me to imagine a more famous social theorist. I'm trying to think about somebody who'd be more famous. One of the most famous. And in fact, if you looked on YouTube, you probably found hundreds of things just all over the place. He got so famous that some people got down on him just because you're always citing Foucault. But for most of you, this seems to be something that you've approached with fresh eyes, as if he never existed before. A number of books. I just wanted to mention one, which is The Birth of the Prison, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, which is a really interesting idea. In some ways, in the olden days, punishment was a public spectacle. People getting hanged, drawn and quartered, and that was the point. To make a public example of people was part of the point. It was all out there in the open. But the idea that people should be incarcerated over time and that it should be hidden away and that you should learn from that experience is a new thing, a new idea in human history. And he also talks about in there, he's one of the people who talks about how he was this regime of surveillance so that you would always know that you were being watched and therefore you're supposed to modify your behavior. The history of sexuality has been hugely influential. It would be hard to underestimate its influence actually in areas such as queer theory and throughout the academy. Like I said, so much to the extent that it's almost assumed that it's part of what you do and know. Now, this quote, sexual practices had little need of secrecy. Words were said without undue resonance, and things were done without too much concealment. One had a tolerant familiarity with the illicit. What is he talking about here? About a time when some sexual practices had little need of secrecy. When was this? There's a huge part of this that you have to realize that he's not saying that sexuality was never repressed. He's saying that there was a time when it was relatively not repressed. He is saying that before the 17th century and capitalism really takes off, that there was just a lot of stuff that you didn't hide the kids away to talk about sex. It was just part of everyday life. It was just something that was there. Why would the capitalists want to do something about this?
They wanted to control the working class.
Control the working class. Yes, great quote. At a time when labor capacity was being systematically exploited, how could this capacity be allowed to dissipate itself in pleasurable pursuits? Right? What are we letting people have sex for when they're supposed to be working? They shouldn't just be goofing off and dissipating themselves in sex, except in those reduced to a minimum that enabled it to reproduce itself, right? So where sex belongs is in the bedroom and for reproduction. That's where it belongs. You're not supposed to just be having sex all the time. That's silly. So we have this idea, and this is not necessarily unique to Foucault. In fact, Foucault is in some ways, as we'll see, he's questioning the idea of a straightforward, what was called the repressive hypothesis. So he's not necessarily doing this straight up, but he is telling us that this is a basic outline of what happens in Europe during the 17th century as we go from sexuality basically being relatively not repressed to one in which people are trying to confine it. Sexuality was carefully confined, it moved into the home. A single locus of sexuality was acknowledged in social space as well as at the heart of every household, but it was a utilitarian and fertile one, the parents' bedroom. That was the only place where people were supposed to have sex. You don't have sex all over the place, and you're supposed to only have reproductive sex, not other kinds of sex. That would be silly. So remember, what he's doing here is a history of sexuality. He's talking to us about something that is not the same over time. So before Foucault, people would often assume that sexuality was a natural constant. And here Foucault is telling us that no, it has a historical, people make it into something that changes over time and over place. Now, he also has some interesting ideas about sex and sin. And again, he says, it is certainly legitimate to ask why sex was associated with sin for such a long time. That is a good question. What else should we ask? We must also ask why we burden ourselves today with so much guilt for having once made sex a sin. So this is an interesting. At first, he's saying, sure, and a lot of people do this. Like, how did it become that sex was associated with sin? How did that happen in our society? But he goes on to say, why do we in our time feel guilty about that? And so that's part of he's going beyond this simple repressive hypothesis to say, why does it make us feel guilty that we did that back in the day? This is interesting because Foucault was writing this in the 1960s and 1970s at a time that was called the sexual revolution. And so what he was saying is that because people believed sex was repressed, then just talking about it felt like, hey, we're being revolutionary here. We're being out there. We're creating a new society. As he says, our tone of voice shows that we know we are being subversive. Tomorrow, sex will be good again. All right. So the idea is just by talking about it, we're being subversive here. And he's questioning that in the sense that he's saying that it's not just that sexuality was repressed. It's that sexuality becomes part of this whole, what he calls this regime of power, knowledge, pleasure. And so in later instances of this, or as he goes along, what he's saying is it became focused in certain areas like psychiatry, doctors' offices. It became not repressed, but focused upon in a peculiar way. So what happens is sexuality goes from being something that really wasn't, and it was just part of the everyday or not to be commented on, to being particularly focused upon in this power, knowledge, pleasure, and a subject of talk, but in certain areas or certain parts of the world. So it's at one and the same time an interesting exploration of how things have changed and of the idea of the repressive hypothesis, but also trying to get us away from the simple version of the repressive hypothesis and away from the idea that simply by talking about sex, that was liberation. He was trying to temper that enthusiasm for you might say, in the sexual revolution for that. It's interesting to think about in today's world in today's world of the United States, what has changed and not changed in regard to how we talk about sex. Suffered the consequences. One of the earlier victims of HIV at a time when there was really no treatments for it. So not sure if we'll be sad for a second. Anyway, everybody wanted to do Foucault. I didn't think anybody was going to do this article. Romancing the Transgender Native. What's it about? Actually, on page 211, they say, remember how I said that everybody wants to, where's like Foucault, blah. Well before Michel Foucault restored historicity to the study of sexuality, anthropologists had provided ethnographic accounts of gender practices in various cultures. And so what they say is, long before Foucault even became Foucault, anthropologists were out there documenting what were considered strange gender practices. So at first, people just looked at these as the weird things that people do, and we might read about them in anthropology, but it's exotic stuff, right? But then in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, today, these accounts of different gender configurations became very popular for people who were activists or political, for being able to say, no, look, our society, our two-gender system is not the only way to do things. There's all these things which have been going on for a long time in human history. And so what they're doing here is in some ways reflecting on this third gender idea that was introduced through anthropology and into anthropology, but in some ways questioning how it's been adopted or co-opted or celebrated for this activist agenda. Now, I want to go back to something we talked about during the Anthropology and the Savage Slot article. So we were talking there about, in most versions of the savage slot from the Western perspective, the savage is seen as inferior, primitive, or backward, or bad in relation to us in the West. But I told you that there was a noble savage version, which is that they live in this gentle harmony with nature, and we are the bad ones in this scenario. And it was the hippies like this idea, or some environmentalists, right? We talked about that. I think we can look at this article and see that this also has applied in the realm of sexuality. So in the realm of sexuality, right, there's this idea that we in the West, in the United States, at least for most of our history, had repressed our sexuality, that we only had two genders, that we're locked into this repressive system, and that they over there are like, ooh, so beyond, they're so cool over there. And so, as Towle and Morgan put it, oftentimes in these accounts, the transgender native is portrayed not as a normal, fallible human being living within the gender constraints of his or her own society, but as an appealing, exalted, transcendent being, often a hero or healer. And so this is what they're talking about, is that in some ways this became a version of the savage slaws. Oh, they're the ones who can heal us if we can go back to their practices. They're not trying to say that we shouldn't look to other societies, but their point is they talk about flaws. Several flaws emerge in this utilization. And basically, it's trying to tell us it is fine to look to other societies, but just look out that you don't romanticize the savage slot. So what do they mean by that? The idea that they out there are the natural ones, or what they call the primordial location, that that's what has always been, that people were always third gender, and we're the ones that are unnatural, or we're the ones that are bad here. So that, this again, and we can talk about this in all sorts of different ways. People often do this, hunter-gatherers, right? They're the natural, they're living in harmony with their primordial state, but we've deviated from that. So watch out for those ideas. And they talk about how, right, oftentimes what people do is they take a diversity of cultures or different ideas, and then they lump it all into one category. So you take examples from India, and you take examples from indigenous people in the Americas or Native Americas, and then you take something from a different society and you say, wow, and then you put it all together into one third gender category, when in fact those might be quite different ideas about gender that need to be explored. And they also talk about something that we have been talking about at least since Eric Wolf and the Europe and the People Without History, is this idea that it tends to put people into these boxes, the West or the United States, as compared to the others or an us against them. Now, again, this is usually done in a derogatory way, right? But it can be done in this romantic way. They are, in some ways, I won't say they're equally problematic, but there is a problem of the romanticization. And one of the problems that we've talked about is that isolation of putting people into separate boxes or categories ignores the connections between us and them over time, the interconnection. And it also tends to ignore the differences both within our own society and the differences or diversity within other societies as well. Kind of lumps people together. I thought this was a good one to check out. I try in my intro classes not to be too romancing of the third gender idea, but every so often I fear I could be falling into this stereotype. I hope not.